Well, all four of our speakers are going to reflect on the 25 years and some of the achievements, some of the problems, where they thought we were going 25 years ago, what the problems were 25 years ago, what life was like 25 years ago. I must say, I was a little bit maudlin coming tonight because I watched the Don Dunstan interview on the ABC, and it did actually remind me. I mean, I came to South Australia in 1974, the very year the Society was established, believe it or not, to take up a position in medieval European history, but that's another story. But it's very easy to forget how much the world has changed in that 25-year period. To see newsreel footage of Don Dunstan in 1972 giving on the step of Parliament House press statements, he must have been viewed as an extraordinary creature. He looks relatively okay looking back, but in 1972 he really did stand out. And it does remind us how much the world has changed. And I'd better stop or I'll have become the fifth speaker, so I'll introduce Dr. John TREGENZA.
Well, fellow members and friends of the Historical Society of South Australia, on this special occasion, the first meeting in our 25th year of continuous and vigorous life, I'm going to deliver again, using my old notes, the speech I made on 9th of July 1974. The meeting took place in the Dumas Gallery of the Art Gallery of South Australia, and something like 200 people were present. The Honourable Don Hopgood, then Minister for Mines and Development and a former student of mine, was intended to move this motion, but was prevented from doing so by illness, and I was asked to take his place. At that time I held the position of Reader in History in the University of Adelaide. Before I repeat that speech, I'd like to say a few words about the general context in which this founding move took place. For 9 years, 1964 to 1973, Australia had been increasingly focused on the undeclared war in Vietnam and the conscription of 20-year-old Australian men by ballot for service in that war. I can testify personally to the strain of those 9 years, for many of my students had to register for potential service, and I was actively involved in the campaign for peace in Vietnam. 9 years, a long time. With the election of the Whitlam government on 2 December 1972, our troops were soon withdrawn from Vietnam, and with leadership from Whitlam himself, we could start to focus on the history and culture and future of Australia itself. Whitlam established a major inquiry, the Piggott Inquiry, into museums throughout Australia. They have visited 40 museums overseas as well, and set up the Australian Heritage Commission to be complementary. He meant there to be a Museums Commission, but he was dismissed from office before it could be set up. In South Australia, as a byproduct of these initiatives, the Dunstan government in 1974 set up its own inquiry into the future development of the Art Gallery, the old police barracks complex, and the South Australian Museum. The brief included consideration of the conservation, acquisition and interpretation of historical items. In short, in 1974, there was a new public and governmental interest in Australian history, and the time was ripe for the founding of a new society. This is what I said on the 19th of July 1974. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honour and a pleasure to move that a Historical Society of South Australia be formed. I've felt the need for such a society for some years, and at different times have talked with my former student Brian Samuels about it. I think we all stand in debt to him and to the chairman, who is Ron GIBBS, sitting next to Brian at the moment, and Mr. John Tolley, who was chairman of the Historical Division of the Royal Geographical Society at the time. As I spoke to Brian yesterday about this, and he said he felt it was very important to get him on side, because at that stage that was the only sort of historical society, but it was logical to have a separate historical society and a separate geographical society. But Brian did get him on side, and so those three in particular, I think we were in debt to them for taking the initiative to act now. Societies do not just happen. People have to get together and spend many hours making plans to reach the position we're now in, where it is possible for a public meeting to take the necessary formal steps. If you will support this motion, we can then, as members, go ahead to plan its functions and policies. All of us will see the society from our own particular background. We live in different places, we're of different ages, we have different occupations. I see the possibilities of the society from the point of view of a university teacher, who's been concerned with South Australian history mainly as the supervisor over the last 11 years of many honours and postgraduate theses on aspects of South Australian history. Students have worked very hard at their research, and many of their findings deserve to be more widely known. As it is, their theses are placed in libraries and departmental cupboards and read mainly by fellow students and scholars. Only a very few have found their way into print in the form of an article. Mr. Don Hopwood, for example, wrote a BA honours thesis some years back under my supervision on Lang Labour in South Australia, which threw quite an interesting light on the interwar Labour Party in this state. An article derived from it was published in the Canberra journal, Labour History. But even in this case, there would probably be many in this meeting who would not know of its existence. I am hoping that a new Historical Society of South Australia could bring the research findings of students and others investigating South Australian history to a wider audience in the way the Royal Geographical Society does in the field of geography. I mean, it had been publishing a journal going back into the 19th century. It could do this in two ways, by lectures, also true of the Royal Geographical Society, by lectures and by publishing a journal. Such a journal could not only publish articles but help to keep all those interested in South Australian history in touch through accounts of local history societies, reviews of books, and lists of any important findings of papers, historical exhibitions, and so on. This is not in the original lecture, but I had begun my lecturing career at the University College of Newcastle on Hunter, so the next remarks relate to that period of my life before I came to Adelaide. If the Newcastle and Hunter Valley Historical Society, in conjunction with the Newcastle City Council, can publish quite substantial monographs on Hunter Valley history, then surely it's not beyond the capacity of this state to publish a history journal. This state. I think the proposed society could also fulfil the important role of acting as an organised voice on matters of historical importance, preservation of buildings of historical interest. Here we could possibly work in with the National Trust, perhaps by having a member on the executive. Historians as well as architects should be consulted about heritage buildings. Possibly we could have a special subcommittee in this field. We should encourage the listing and preservation of records and other historical source material. Records exist in the most surprising places. For example, I've learned of Boer War diaries and letters at the Fort Largs Police Academy. I don't know what's happened to those. It might be worth checking. We could encourage preservation of papers which could be destroyed. For example, quite valuable papers of the Law Society of South Australia, which I believe were mouldering in a basement of one of the courthouses. I learnt that from Professor Luca of the Law Department. We need to list and copy papers which have been removed to Canberra. I'm not sure that that's ever been done. For example, the papers of the firm of Elder Smith, what's up? They're in Canberra, but the point is, should we have them listed and copied or microfilmed and available here? Should we have to go to Canberra to read the papers of our own companies? I mean, that's my point. For example, also the papers of the South Australian Institute of Teachers, I believe. I'm interpolating here. Canberra has been very active in collecting it here, the National University. And Melbourne was very active in collecting, but we had nothing like that here until the Mortlock Library was established with a field officer. We also need to help preserve historical films on South Australia, and I mentioned Harry Crishock and Mr. Reeves. We also need to support oral history, which was a new thing in the 1970s. Above all, such a society could encourage others to take an interest in all matters historical. Individuals, teachers, local councils, governments. It could lead the people of South Australia to discover how interesting their own history can be. I commend the motion. Now that was the speech of 1974. How far have my expectations been realised? We've certainly had a regular lecture program and an annual issue of our own journal, complemented by the more frequent issue of a newsletter ever since. As editor of the first two numbers of the journal, and here they are, they're fairly rare items these days, but that's the first one and that's the second. I can testify that the role of editor is no light task. You have to seek out appropriate articles, see that they're properly documented, give gentle encouragement to authors who are running late, find reviewers of a range of new books, sometimes by rather desperate appeal, and then see that the journal is properly printed and bound. From the beginning I was determined, even if it meant printing in large type, much larger than today I would think, with footnotes literally there, and not too big a page. That also helped to thicken it out sufficiently to have the title and the year and the number on the spine. I hate anonymous publications on my bookshelves, and fortunately that has persisted. Yes, it has. It has, and it has done it year after year, with only one exception, unfortunately, number 21 from 1993, which carried our first index of all previous articles. This is otherwise always been the case. And with one exception, unfortunately, number 14 of the Jubilee 150 year, 1986, they've all been well bound. That one fell to pieces. But these two exceptions only serve to demonstrate how vigilant the editor needs to be right through to the actual publication. The third number was jointly edited by Dr. John Playford and Graham Lachlan, and then John Playford alone edited numbers 4 to 20. A mammoth contribution to the Society, and it is a matter of much sadness that he cannot be here tonight to celebrate the 25 years with us. From number 21 onwards, Dr. Jenny Tilby-Stock has ably shouldered the burden and maintained the standard that the Society and the historical community at large has come to expect. As a society, we've not been as active a pressure group as I envisaged, but individual members, including the other three speakers tonight, have played significant roles in setting up the History Trust, getting buildings onto heritage registers, writing articles for the Australian Dictionary of Biography and attending meetings of its South Australian Working Party, putting on historical exhibitions, opening the Mortlock Library of South Australiana, complete with an oral history section, very ably and devotedly developed by Beth Robertson. So all in all, I think we can be very pleased with what we've accomplished. We've stayed the course, we haven't faltered and collapsed, we're financially in a sound position. Finally, on a less serious note, I'd like to do two things. Play 1 minute of a fire and brimstone sermon, which I collected on a visit to Cornwall in 1975, just the year after this body was founded. I went seeking to photograph letters written home by Cornish settlers in Australia last century. I had a hunch that a lot of Australian social history was actually in the British Isles in the form of these letters written home to relatives. And I think, in fact, I went to Cornwall because my name is Cornish, although I've got more Scottish ancestors than Cornish ones, but nevertheless the name sounded good in Cornwall. As A.L. Rouse once said to me, the Cornish historian, he wrote to me, how I envy your indubitably Cornish name. But so I went there and I got in touch with all the newspapers that served Cornwall, about 14 of them. It's quite a big place, Cornwall. And I went on the BBC, I went on independent television, and I asked for people to get in touch with me at the Cornwall County Record Office if they had any letters in their possession. And I said I'd go anywhere to photograph them, knowing that people wouldn't want to part with the originals, and I did that. And these are all now in the Mortlock Library, where they can be located, probably best through Beth Robertson. It's a bit difficult to find them as they are through the normal channels. So while I was there, Joe Pengelly of the BBC gave me this tape that I want to play a little sample from. And then I want to show 10 quick slides illustrating some of the uses of the pictures which can be found in the South Australian Historical Pictures Index, which I founded in 1977 and worked on for the next 10 years, with my wife Jean as an honorary assistant at the beginning and from time to time thereafter, and Kathleen Petitsis as a paid research assistant for several of those years. The index, which is in about 90 green ring binders, can be consulted in the Historical Treasures reading room of the Mortlock Library. Recorded by Joe Pengelly of the BBC in Plymouth in the mid-1960s, he was based in Plymouth, just after the scandal involving the Minister of Defence, Mr. Profumo, and the call girl, Christine Keeler, with whom he apparently shared Christine with a Russian member of the Russian embassy. Joe Pengelly heard it delivered to a Methodist congregation in St. Just, near Land's End. And after the service, asked the lay preacher, an old miner who'd been preaching for 30 years, whether he could deliver the sermon again while it was recorded. Being as experienced in the sermon business as Mr. Starkadder in Cold Comfort Farm, he was quite ready to oblige. So what you're about to hear is a calculated performance put on specially for Joe Pengelly. Just 1 minute.
When we look at the Bible and read of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, how did it happen? There are thousands of illustrations, is my firm belief. I often think in my little mind, simple though I may be, that the same destruction that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah through its wickedness, lust, and vice, and corruption, and homosexuality is the same power that can destroy this universe. And some of our great sinners today, to me I'm sorry to say, are like a glorified Sodom and Gomorrah, corruption and vice. Sodom and Gomorrah had his chance, we have our chance. Some no regards for God more than a spare car tire. But when they come to die, they call for mercy. And
well, if you can imagine many a sermon like that being preached in early South Australia. He speaks very movingly of the great John Wesley. St. Paul and John Wesley were the great Christians, and it was John Wesley who lifted up the poor miner, whom the church had neglected, but the poor ignorant miner who could nor read nor write. John Wesley lifted him up, allowed him to read the Bible. Anyway, if you want to hear the whole thing, the whole 10 minutes, you can hear it in Beth Robertson's Oral History Collection, OH279, and you can hear 3 other tape recordings that I brought back from Cornwall too. Beth could also give you the Mortlock accession number for the Cornish letters and diaries I photographed in Cornwall. Now finally, the slides. The pictures, the hand-done pictures, can all be found in the South Australian Historical Pictures Index. And I'll just say something about the relevance of them as they come up. Well now, this is simply to illustrate what I did in my art gallery years. I've had 4 different careers: University of Adelaide, Art Gallery of South Australia, History Trust, and finally as a consulting historian writing books on commission. But this was my art gallery days. I put on 12 exhibitions in my years in the art gallery. One of the things I tried to do, on the left is a lithograph from South Australia illustrated by George French Angus, or Giles after George French Angus, showing a woman near the Coorong. As someone astutely pointed out, she's not entirely wearing the map that you can see, the real thing. I believed in putting pictures with over a period of years, and if you want to see a photographic record of all those exhibitions, some of you may well have seen them, and they were in the Historical Museum, the Art Gallery, now the Art Gallery's auditorium. I've deposited the photographic record in my personal papers in the Bar Smith Library Special Collection. It's open 1 to 4, Monday to Friday. This brings me to my first job apart from putting on exhibitions. When I went to the art gallery, Don Dunstan had said that the art gallery would be responsible for a historical museum in the old Parliament House. So I was sent post-haste, top speed, to go down and look at the place and come up with a report on its suitability as a historical museum. And that's what I saw when I went down there in 1976. That was the House of Assembly chamber as it then looked. I think it was used for ballet classes. And you can see, not a very inspiring space. But I knew that there was a painting by James Shaw, that showed it as it was after that's an actual false ceiling had been put in to improve the ventilation. There were a lot of satirical comments about that in the press, that it hadn't worked, but they did put in an artificial a ceiling with ventilators going up. And James Shaw depicted, now I knew of James Shaw that he depicted houses for a living. He depicted them. He didn't paint them. He depicted them. And if they had 50 fence palings at the front, you can be quite sure if it still existed or they were wrought iron, you could photograph it today and there would be 50 there. Therefore, I thought this is highly likely to be very accurate. And people said, but would the walls have been as green as that? And I said, well, he's accurate in everything I've been able to test. Scrape away and see what you find. And on the right you can see the results of the scraping. Of course they finally got down to the yellow, but you can see a sort of green band just around the yellow as one of the layers going in. And so ultimately they painted it green, and it was logical because it was the lower house, and green is the colour of the lower house, as you see in the Federal Parliament and in our own. And then, as I and others discovered, Peter Donovan and Barry Rowney did a much more thorough architectural survey of the building, because the parliamentarians wanted more car park space, and they were prepared to knock down all but the front row of rooms in this building to get a few more cars in, convenient to Parliament House. Others wanted to demolish it entirely and put up a 10-storey building, and fortunately Peter Sharp of the Public Buildings Department got wind of this, and he set Donovan and Rowney to write a careful report. And all of us found that there, in the original drawings, there were these beautiful beams concealed, and as we have air conditioning now, they could be brought out. And there you see the actual opening when it was all restored with the portrait of Governor Gore over there, or a facsimile of it, just as in the James Shaw painting. The sad thing about all this, of course, is that it was turned into a splendid historical museum. The public could come up and see it. You could have historical events in the chamber, and now it's been closed down by the Minister for Arts, Diana Laidlaw, because it wasn't making quite enough money, and the parliamentarians wanted to use all the space in it, although there's apparently a large area in the Riverside section that's still unoccupied on the ground floor. Now this is another example of the use of a painting to preserve a building. Now that building might be familiar to you. I took that photograph probably about 1981 when it had these very ugly screens out, and of course the name for light is, you can't avoid that in Adelaide, but it's a familiar building, but that's what it looked like. It was the first high building in Adelaide, and I was then a member of the Lord Mayor's Heritage Advisory Committee. Patricia Summerling was one of the professional historians who would bring raw material to us, and we'd project them they would be projected on the screen, and then the committee would make a decision. Now, I wasn't able to be present on the occasion when this building was discussed, but I sent this slide together with an argument for its preservation, and that slide seemed to have carried the day, because it's still there. You can see this is the days of bullock wagons, and there's a port cart. I can actually walk around with this thing. That's a port cart there. Can it be a little bit sharpened? Can we bring it up, madam? I'm not the expert in this, but I can offer a couple of journals. So. Is that enough? No? 2 journals? Help? Can you see that now? More? Here. The 3 journals. Will do it. How's that? That's better? Now you can see the importance of this particular slide, because to the artist you can see it was a towering building. It depends a bit on the aspect. I think he must have actually done the drawing, the original drawing, halfway across the road. Now there's another one also, and you can see how it's very likely that this painting, which is the 1860s by an artist called Wadham, and you can see the beehive on the left. Is that? I suppose it's as sharp as it can be seen. But that, of course, is the original beehive. So the name wasn't just invented by the people who put up the present building. But there is the building in question on the right, and you can see that since the days of those very ugly shades, quite a lot's been done to bring the building back to its original or attractive appearance. Unfortunately, the heavy shade on the right hides the name Polites. Now, this is another use of historical pictures, is to question conventional icons. And this is the Hindmarsh Building Society image of Governor Hindmarsh, actually long after he was Governor of South Australia, when he'd become an admiral. But this portrait on the right, which hangs in the Special Collections room of the reading room of the Bar Smith Library, was done by Hindmarsh's daughter about the time he was Governor of South Australia, or perhaps just before he migrated to become Governor. So that's the man you should think of, and not the man on the left. And the same thing, Edward John Eyre, the one on the left, sometimes reproduced in school textbooks, shows the Governor in old age after he'd savagely put down a riot, a massive riot in Jamaica with a great many people hung and so on. Hence Dutton's biography, The Hero as Murderer. But this painting I discovered in Parliament House. This shows that he was like a matinee idol when he was walking from Adelaide to Western Australia. And I had in my possession a beautiful silk Union Jack when I was in my care, I should say, as curator of the historical collection, made expressly for Eyre to plant on the centre of Australia by the ladies of Adelaide, and presented to him in Government House before he set off for Central Australia. So when he hit all those salt lakes, and he thought that it's impossible to get through, this a great arc of salt lakes, impossible, he couldn't possibly come back to Adelaide in humiliation with his silk flag made by the ladies of Adelaide. So instead he decided to walk across to Western Australia. At least that was a feat. But you can see that this is the man of the time, a young man. And this is John McDowell Stewart. Now you often see him presented as a pretty rough, tough diamond from there's stories about him falling off his horse in a drunken state at Jepp's Cross, which may well be true, but in actual fact, I mean, he had his third go at crossing Australia. But in actual fact, he was a man of much sensitivity and culture, as you can see from his personal possessions. And this is his smoking cap on the right. A magnificent smoking cap that would outdo the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland. I actually have seen a photograph of the Overland Telegraph constructors, and one of them's there in all his bush gear, but wearing a smoking cap like this. So it's quite possible that at the end of a hard day, there was a sort of ritual of sitting down. There's his pipe, an elegant pipe, truncated of course, but elegant. Sitting down, putting on his smoking cap, having his relaxing time under a tree. You don't know, but it's part of the man. And finally, you can see some of his equipment over here. His sextant, his artificial horizon, beautiful telescope. He had the latest equipment. He was no novice at traversing large distances in Australia. And on the left, you can see this is the last exhibition that I put on, which was in the Mortlock Library in the Historical Treasures Room, and this was partly a deal with the History Trust, which had hoped to control the whole of the old public library building. But I'd become convinced myself that it was impossible to make it do all the things we hoped that it might do, but it could be a Library of South Australiana with an exhibition space. And in the middle there, you can see the prime example which I put together, the Duray Panorama, 1865. Now, I won't go on about it. Many of you perhaps have seen it, but it gives you the impression when you go inside that structure that you're actually on the top of the Town Hall Tower in November 1865, with an amazing detail. You can count the shingles, but you can also see the Brown Place Church in the background and so on. Amazing. And I would like to close by just saying, it's a hopeful note, that can now be seen. It has its own room. It was in storage for quite a long time. It has its own room now in Gaze Arcade on the ground floor on the left, so that it's easily accessible and you don't have to pay a cent. Now, at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I shall bow myself out.
Thank you, John. And there will be an opportunity to put questions to our four speakers at the end of the evening. And just following on from John mentioning the Duray Panorama, just so that we show that we are all high-tech, a reminder that it is also now available on the internet. Now, our next speaker is Associate Professor Peter Howell from Flinders University. I think he holds the record for the most frequently invited back speaker for the Historical Society in its 25 years. I checked that. You've given the most talks of any individual, which is quite some claim to fame. He's been a long proponent, supporter of South Australian history. He served his period of punishment as President of the Historical Society. I must have been more wicked though, I didn't escape after 2 years. And he's also going to share some of his reminiscences of the foundation of the Society. Associate Professor Peter Howell.
No? Yes. I first visited Adelaide in February 1963 to undertake research on an MA thesis that I'd started under the supervision of the late Douglas Pike, who at that time was Professor of History at the University of Tasmania. And the weather in Adelaide that February was unusually hot and humid. I don't think there was another February like that until 2 years ago. And I recall that I went back to Hobart. I quite upset Douglas by suggesting that he'd really made a great mistake, and that South Australia should not have been called the paradise, but the inferno of descent. I thought this quite clever, but Douglas was quite unable to see the joke. But what surprised me even more was that the discovery that South Australia, in contrast to every other state in the country, didn't have a state historical society. 3 years later, I accepted a lectureship at the brand new Flinders University of South Australia, and I found that quite a few people here shared my concern about this, but it needed somebody with the energy to actually do something about it. And so we're all indebted to Brian Samuels for gingering up a group who were willing to take action and establish the society that we still have today. It was a difficult time to begin. The then Prime Minister, Mr. Whitlam, was seeking to diminish, not enhance, the role of the states, and in that spirit his government had abolished the grants towards the cost of their publications that state historical societies have been receiving from the Commonwealth since Menzies had introduced them 20 years before. Secondly, in the first year of the Historical Society of South Australia's existence, the rate of inflation reached 17%, the highest that it had been since the gold rushes of the 1850s. And that high inflation made budgeting a very precarious exercise when we had absolutely no capital reserves. But skillful and persistent lobbying by our first president, Ron Gibbs, secured a grant from the South Australian government in 1975. But at $500, it was much smaller than the grants that our interstate counterparts received from their state governments. And it had to be fought for all over again every year to maintain it. Some people in the eastern states at that time hoped for a restoration of the Commonwealth subsidies to historical societies after Mr. Whitlam lost office in November 1975. But the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, proclaimed a policy of reducing government expenditure. And so in 1977, Justice Else Mitchell, President of the New South Wales Association, which grandly called itself the Royal Australian Historical Society, convened a meeting at which a Federation of Australian Historical Societies was formed, especially for the purpose of acting as a pressure group to lobby Canberra to change its mind. And that objective was attained in 1978. Mr. Fraser, who of course will always be best remembered for opining that life wasn't meant to be easy, was far less generous than Menzies and Holt and Gorton and McMahon had been. Nevertheless, for 6 years we did receive $700 or $800 a year from the Commonwealth to help meet our printing bills. But even that modest assistance came to an end when Fraser, in his turn, was ousted by Bob Hawke. I put it to the new Minister for Health, Neil Blewett, who'd been a good friend of mine since 1944, when we were neighbours in Launceston. It looked as if the federal Labor was afraid of history. And he explained that it was the new government's policy that if state-based societies needed assistance from the public purse, then it was for the state government to supply it. It had nothing to do with the Commonwealth. And there it stayed. So by and large, our society had to make its own way, and it had quite a hard row to hoe in the first few years. It was never able to acquire capital sufficient to embark on the ambitious book publishing ventures that have been great money spinners for similar societies elsewhere. Before settling in Adelaide, I'd for several years been a member of the executive committee of the Tasmanian counterpart, the Tasmanian Historical Research Association, and I enjoyed that experience and was therefore happy to stand for election to this present Society's inaugural council. And having served on the executive of both societies, I thought that you might let me this evening draw a few comparisons, just a few. I could do quite a few more, but in the first place, the Tasmanian Association's journal has generally been issued quarterly, though one year they actually had 6 issues. But more importantly, it's entitled Papers and Proceedings, because it long combined the functions of a newsletter and scholarly journal within the one periodical. In the South Australian Society, these functions have always been divided, and I think this is a much better system. On the one hand, a newsletter is more useful if it can come out bi-monthly. And Dr. Playford managed to produce 2 issues in 1978 and again in 1980. But in a time when printing and binding costs, to say nothing of postal charges, have been historically high, our Society's general practice of producing one number of its journal each year is considerably more economical than publishing it on a quarterly basis. Another contrast between the Tasmanian and South Australian societies has been the spread of membership. The first 100 people who took out membership of the Tasmanian Historical Research Association embraced a substantial number of individuals from other Australian states. They included people like Frank Crowley, then at the height of his powers at the University of Western Australia, Melbourne's Marnie Lady Bassett, completing what has become a celebrated book on the Henties of Portland Bay, and the young Geoffrey Blaney, who was writing the MA thesis which became his first book, Peaks of Lyell. Other mainlanders who joined in those first years included a number of South Australians. I don't know how many Tasmanians we've ever had, but certainly the South Australians joined down in Hobart, including people like James Daly, who's still flourishing in North Adelaide as a publisher and bookseller, and Marjorie Casson, perhaps nowadays best remembered for initiating and organising the campaign which saved the Grange, the erstwhile home of early explorer and public servant Charles Sturt. And those people like that were joined by others like Laurie Fitzharding, biographer William Morris Hughes, and Manning Clark, both of the Australian National University. It was highly characteristic of Clark that in his first contribution to the Tasmanian Association's Papers and Proceedings, he complained that in Australia most of the historians have lost sight of the art of writing in their attempt to make the study of the past into a science. And of course he did become obsessional about producing a work of art rather than anything else. But the Tasmanian Society's initial members also included lots of other mainland people whose names will long be familiar to those who read Australian history or biography. For example, in the first year that we had members like Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Margaret Kiddle, Clive Turnbull, P.L. Brown, Mr. Justice Barry, and the young Michael Rowe, all from Melbourne. And we had John Ward, A.G.L. Shaw, Brian Plumley, Hazel King, M.C.I. Levy from Sydney, and plus the nation's best-known bibliophile of that era, Sir William Dixon, and that most prolific bibliographer, Mr. Justice Ferguson. So there are all these people from outside subscribing. Within a few months, virtually every state and university library in the country took out a subscription to the Tasmanian Association's Papers and Proceedings. But so did the principal libraries in North America and several in the United Kingdom. And I think it was the Historical Society of South Australia's great misfortune that by the time word had got around the country that the first number of our Society's journal had appeared in February 1976, although it's got the date 75 on it, budgetary restraints were compelling librarians to begin making those cutbacks in their purchasing of books and journals, which have become a way of life for them ever since. In universities, for example, it became the rule that no new periodical subscription could be taken out unless an existing one of at least similar value was cancelled. So as a result of entering a long period of recession in the late 1970s, with governments simultaneously choosing to go with the tide of economic rationalism that is still affecting us all, the Historical Society of South Australia, in contrast to its counterparts in other states, has never had that solid core of subscriptions from interstate and overseas institutions, as well as a big body of interstate and overseas members that have helped to boost the income of the older historical societies in the country. Climate, curiously enough, was another bonus for the Tasmanians. Most South Australians couldn't imagine that, but In the 1950s, when no Australian university provided air-conditioned office space for its teaching staff, there were more than a dozen historians from mainland universities who chose to escape some of the worst summer heat by undertaking to work on topics which required them to engage in research in the Tasmanian State Archives for a month or two, while their undergraduate students were having a long vacation. And the Tasmanian Historical Research Association seized the opportunity of persuading many of these visitors to address meetings of the association while they were in Hobart, and or to write papers for its journal. And that set a pattern which persisted into the 1960s. George Rudo, for example, spent at least 6 summers in Hobart during his years in Adelaide, and Henry Reynolds of the James Cook University of North Queensland for over 30 years has visited Hobart most summers in that time. Well, the practice of securing contributions from prominent Australian historians has continued to the present day, because on the death in 1967 of Peter Eldershaw, who had edited the Tasmanian Association's papers and proceedings since 1951, a fund was raised in his memory, and since that time this has been used to bring another 30 mainlanders to Tasmania to give an annual Eldershaw Memorial Lecture. And so that's kept the contributions. And as our Society's first president, Ron Gibbs, remarked in 1975 in the First Journal, when he was discussing the work of D.W. Meinig and Michael Williams on South Australian history, Ron said visitors from outside the state can often offer new perspectives simply because they bring a vision sharpened by experiences and observations elsewhere. Here in Adelaide, we've had much less success in enticing the leading historians from other parts of the nation to visit, do research into and present their findings on South Australian history. Indeed, it's been our constant complaint that so many of those who address national topics or national themes write from within an exclusively Eastern States perspective. Even in their bibliographies, too many interstate authors don't acknowledge the existence of relevant South Australian work and work published here, despite all our protests about their practice. I do hope that some means might be found for remedying this problem long before our society celebrates its Golden Jubilee. Meanwhile, the Historical Society of South Australia's achievements to date have been impressive. South Australians have always had an exceptional record for being joiners, that is, willing to chip in and do their bit for community organisations. And this has doubtless helped the Society to attract a succession of particularly able people to serve on the Council, to organise and lead excursions, and a range of fundraising activities, and equally, even perhaps more able people to edit its publications. The activities of the first full year, 1975, set the pattern. Meetings, in those days generally held in the State Library Lecture Theatre on the first Friday of the month, were addressed by a wide range of professional and amateur historians. There were field trips to Gawler and Kapunda, led by Michael Williams, Anlaby, hosted by Geoffrey Dutton, and the Barossa, led by Ian Harmstorff, plus a wonderful night of old documentary films shown by Vic Reeves. And with many Adelaideans resentful of the Dunstan government's acquiescence in the demolition of the grand old South Australian Hotel, to be replaced by just another of Sir Reg Ansett horrendously hideous lodging houses for people taking package holidays with Ansett Pioneer, the Society convened a weekend seminar on the report on the national estate and its implications for local history. Not least in importance, the practice of having a light supper at the end of each meeting was inaugurated in that first year, and it helped to make this one of the friendliest societies I've ever been a member of. And the pattern of activities set in 1975 worked so well that it has, with few additions, notably fundraising, it serves as a model and a basis for all that's happened since. And I'm sure you'll join with me in wishing the Society every success for its next 25 years.
Thanks, Rob. I'm not going to reflect on the Society tonight. When I was approached to speak, I was given the freedom to talk more broadly. I still feel a bit too close, having spent 20 odd years on the Council, and I don't think I can reflect on it all that usefully, although obviously I've got lots of fond memories. So what I'm going to do is reflect on history and heritage over the last 25 years. Just to give it a context, I should say that when my interest in local history happened through a strange set of circumstances in my late teens, and that was when I discovered that Port Adelaide had had a local history written, and that Vernon Smith, who some of you may remember as the very long-serving curator of what was the Port Adelaide Nautical Museum, I chanced upon his scrapbook of history, and I was bitten. And that was the start of my passionate affair with local history, which soon spread into South Australian history. So that was in my late teens. I did my honours history thesis on community in the Port Adelaide district under John Tregenza, and had the benefit of some other very inspiring teachers there. I then was posted for my sins to Port Augusta, with teaching with the Education Department, and that put paid to my hopes of getting the society going at that stage, because I'd been talking to Ron GIBBS and John Tregenza and Derek Whitelock and others about, why hasn't the state got a historical society? It seems such an obvious thing for a state to have. It was that simple as far as I was concerned. I was posted to Port Augusta. During my year there in 73, I was appointed honorary historian of the newly formed Port Adelaide Historical Society. Came back in 74 and moved to get the State Society going as quickly as I could. And then I was fortunate to end up spending most of my career working in history. And that's the point I wanted to make at the beginning. What I've got to say tonight really comes from the perspective of someone who's been lucky enough to work in history as a teacher, as a community resource officer, developing local history curriculum materials and engaged in community development. And then after a brief spell of straight teaching again, joining the History Trust soon after its formation, spending 14 years with the History Trust, and now 3.5 years with Heritage South Australia. So I've been very fortunate to be working in history while maintaining the passion of the amateur historian who just liked history as a hobby, and hoping. Although in the last few years I've found it a bit harder to keep that passion alive in the face of cutbacks and family and young children. That passion really is still there. But my talk tonight is reflecting that background of someone who's been very fortunate to be able to be working in history as well as spending a lot of his free time in the pursuit of history. So, I think that's enough. What I'm going to say tonight is not any attempt to be a balanced account. I haven't gone and consulted records. It's really come out of here. The word history, like the word heritage, suffers from having multiple meanings. Most fundamentally, it can mean the past itself, as well as the quite separate thing that is mankind's accounts about the past. Now that second latter usage entails in turn a host of issues, including of course the fact that there can be no single correct history. Instead, each historian brings his or her own biases to the task of writing history, and makes a host of judgments as to what of all the known facts about the past are significant and worth writing about. This shouldn't distress us, although it would certainly have distressed some of our ancestors who looked for absolute truths and moral precepts in history. The point I'm making is simply that when we talk about history, the word inevitably means different things to different people. Subject areas important to some are dismissed as trivial or not even worthy of notice by others. And hence, generalised appeals to the value and importance of historical knowledge can be expected to stimulate a host of different responses, including the blanket rejection of "I'm not interested in history," which, as we all know, you still encounter. Even though, unless you suffer from amnesia, you're using historical knowledge gained in the past all the time. As I've said, it all really depends on what that word history conjures up in your mind. Now, when I reflect on history over the last 25 years, I can recall very clearly my fundamental motivation in convening the preliminary meetings which led to the Historical Society's formation. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that a knowledge of our own state's past is an essential prerequisite to fully appreciating and enjoying both its natural and its man-made environments. Such knowledge is equally essential if you wish to come to an understanding of the best ways to act upon and change those environments. Now, if you endorse those propositions, then it follows that as a community we need to be recording the present and ensuring that appropriate records are retained, recovering the past and analysing and interpreting it for the benefit of the present, and acknowledging the value of studying the past for its own sake. And of course, this society undertakes some of those tasks, as has already been mentioned, the journal, the newsletter, the lecture meetings, field trips, and so on. Now, the study of history can be justified on a variety of grounds, including being simply a worthwhile recreational activity, or on a higher level as a subject, study of which can increase one's understanding of society and even, dare I say, lead to wisdom. I've always liked to emphasise its value for activists, by which I simply mean individuals wishing to provide leadership to society. One of history's values is as a form of reality therapy. Our age seems to demonstrate an extraordinary capacity for self-delusion and denial of reality. Dare I say, economic rationalism. A knowledge of the past can be a very good antidote to those all too familiar activities of reinventing wheels, seeing every new activity as possessing tourist potential, or believing that progress is inherent in all development. Another value of historical study is its capacity to provide a sense of identity, a feeling of belonging. I like to think that if knowledge of our history was more widespread, it would help provide the state's citizens with a stronger sense of community, which in turn would encourage more people to get involved in the governance of their local communities at whatever level. Looking back on the last 25 years, what is very positive is the seemingly ever-increasing public interest in both history and heritage, evidenced, as we probably all know, by the growth in volunteer-run museums and historical societies. There were about 20 in 1960 and over 300 today. The explosion in historical publishing, the boom in family history, and the popularity of field heritage conservation. While much of this activity has been decidedly locality-based, dedicated amateur historians have also made notable contributions of wider benefit. Think of Jeff Manning's place name books, Andrew Peake's source guides, Bob Hode's hotel book, Bob Noy's website devoted to South Australian photographic history, and the SA Genealogy and Heraldry Society's collaborative publications, to single out just a few. As we all know, there's a host of amateur historians out there doing sterling work across a whole range of local history and other activities. What I've always found very sobering, in contrast to all this positive stuff, is the limited government resources devoted to both fields. As I said at the start, I'm not pretending to be balanced here, but if you think about the government action that's resulted in the closure of the Telecommunications Museum, the Postal Museum, Old Parliament House, the dispersal of the Pioneer Village collection. Even some of the success stories have a sobering side to them. The SA Maritime Museum would not have come into being without the stimulus of the Jubilee 150, and more specifically, a one-off contribution of $1.1 million of Commonwealth funds. Very hard to imagine that place happening without that. The Mile End Railway Museum similarly would not have been transformed into the Port Dock Station Railway Museum without another one-off contribution of Australian Bicentennial, that is Commonwealth funding. Now, obviously we should be grateful for that funding, but they are one-off, and it makes it quite a challenge to keep those places going. Who knows what services the State Library would be providing if it had not received the Mortlock bequest. And again, as is widely known, a lot of the North Terrace institutions, the major cultural institutions, have been very dependent on some very magnificent benefactions for their long-term survival and health. More recently, the Commonwealth Government abolished the State and Territories component of the National Estates Grants Program. So in the face of all this seemingly ever-increasing public interest in history and heritage, there's a sobering side in terms of what government has been able to provide. Looking to the future, and I've just looked at the last 25 years, there are some major gaps in historical knowledge which it is very desirable to fill. Think of the potential value to policymakers, not to mention the intrinsic interest of a general economic history of the state, or a history of tourism for that matter, given its much vaunted role in the economy these days. The pastoral industry, forestry, and a general environmental history are other topics requiring attention, along with histories of such once major departments as land and public buildings, now absorbed and carved up under various reorganisations. In the museum field, it seems extraordinary that there is nowhere you can go to get an overview of the state's history, despite the 190 odd museums we've got in the state. And equally extraordinary that lack of resources and space has prevented the Investigator Science and Technology Centre from mounting permanent displays on the history of science and technology in this state. More generally, there is a great need for our history to be made more accessible via on-the-ground interpretation. On present indications, it appears that the internet is going to deliver enormous historical riches into our homes. However, there is still no substitute for physically encountering history in the landscape, be it in the solitude of the outback or the bustle of the city. A comprehensive statewide program of interpretive signage would be of lasting value to both tourists and locals. I remember Ron GIBBS in the early years of our society talking about how well the Americans did it. Surely it's an idea whose time has come. And such signage should of course be complemented by high quality, full colour booklets for the more significant places and sites. And of course there are plenty of overseas models for those. Finally, when I dream historical dreams, they're fairly modest ones. With only 10 super departments in the state public service, it isn't a big ask for each of them to have a permanent position for a historian, whose principal duties would entail overseeing record disposal processes, making sure the stuff doesn't get lost, which still happens on a regular basis, I hate to say, researching and documenting the department's history. With the endless reorganisations, a lot of head knowledge just walks out the door, and providing policy advice to the executive to inform current initiatives. Now that model is not at all original, it happens in America. There's clearly a very valuable role that such people could perform. In the days of a multitude of departments, it probably was a big ask. When you're talking about 10 positions, it isn't, but the way I feel at present, I'd imagine it would be the labour of Hercules for those positions to be created. So, enough of the dreaming, the conclusions. I think it's useful to view approaches to the past as stretching along a continuum from preserve everything at one end to development at any cost / history is irrelevant at the other. And many of the arguments in the public arena about the value of history and built heritage conservation are about where on that continuum people choose to take their stand. And while views on the right balance between past, present and future will always be subject to debate, I believe it is indisputable that if we don't know our past, we can't properly know what we should be preserving. And if we don't understand our history, we reduce our capacity to know where our state should be heading. The United States National Park Service Administrative Manual has this to say about the service's interpretive programs. Through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, through appreciation, protection. And that simple philosophy provides ample justification for much of the work I'd like to see undertaken in the coming years. If you prefer a contrary view, I'll leave you with A.J.P. Taylor, writing in 1957, who said that in my opinion we learn nothing from history except the infinite variety of men's behaviour. We study it as we listen to music or read poetry for pleasure, not for instruction. I've prepared some sheets of some of my other favourite quotations on history and heritage. There's two of them, and I'll leave those at the back for you to take over supper. Thank you.
I can't think of anybody better to round off the evening. I hope Ron doesn't mind me saying it, but I sort of regard him as the father figure of the society. He and Brian are always the people I turn to if there's a constitutional issue or a problem, because of their vast experience in running the association. And of course, he's had a long career promoting South Australian history. He's been a teacher in America and in South Australia. I first met him when he was history consultant. Remember the good old days when there were such positions as the history consultant. And of course, it's Ron's book that we all still turn to as the only basic history of South Australia, which in itself is remarkable. First, that he was the one who did it, and secondly, that we haven't had follow-ups to it. We haven't had the second and third and fourth generation yet, but hopefully the society can help to promote that. So would you please make welcome to finish off the evening, Ron GIBBS.
Thank you, Rob. Rob and ladies and gentlemen, I Note that the newsletter said that I would, and I quote, talk about the teaching of history in schools and the historical differences between South Australia and the other states. I was a bit startled to read that because what I volunteered to do was something rather different. And that was, and I quote, to make some observations about history teaching in schools, about the writing of South Australian history in the past quarter of a century, and about the public marking, the visual notifying of our history. And I do that very deliberately in the light of what Brian has already mentioned about signage in history and perhaps the emphasis we put on it in the early days, and perhaps rather sadly the fact that it hasn't come about as we might have wanted. Anyway, in a minute Pat will perhaps help us to explore that if she can work our technology. So we'll stick to what I volunteered to do and spend more time on the last two things rather than the first. A detailed analysis anyway of history teaching in schools would be better left to someone who is at present engaged on that very difficult task. The reason for mentioning it at all here is that the Society was conceived, founded, when the teaching of history was very much in mind and very much discussed. The Society, of course, was not some arm of the Education Department, though one of the two people thought it was, nor was it specially affiliated with the History Teachers Association, though that body has always been a good friend of this society. Nevertheless, the very first aim of this society, and perhaps we should have duplicated a copy of the newsletter of the society, number 1 newsletter, which appeared in December 1974, and it set out our aims, and the very first of these aims is to arouse interest in and to promote the study and discussion of South Australian and Australian history. In 1974, South Australian and Australian history were doing well as school courses. There was a special full-year course on South Australian history available in a number of secondary schools at Year 8 level. Just think of it, a whole year course being devoted to the history of South Australia. Some argued it was too narrow, but it existed and some people found it very fulfilling and worthwhile. Then too there was history, South Australian history and Australian history taught at higher levels at the school. At matriculation level, a full subject of Australian history was available and popular. It was well taught by enthusiastic teachers. It was regarded as one of those subjects that had invigorated the curriculum at that level. It allowed students, among other things, to do their own research and show their abilities at it, and also to do some field work. Students who took the course generally acclaimed it. Well, that was in 1974. Most of these courses continued heartily for a number of years before the decline set in. And this is not the place nor the time to examine the reasons, but the fact of history's decline as a school subject has now been widely publicised. The press, of course, is giving much attention to it just recently. It's mentioned the decline of individual history subjects as well as the decline in the subject overall, particularly at public examination level. Of course, there have been counterclaims about this, as there have been in the universities, about the decline of history as a subject. The counterclaims usually rest on saying that historical knowledge is being acquired in subjects that are not labelled history, that have some other title, the best known of which in schools, of course, has usually been called social studies. This, as some of you well may know, can give rise to sturdy arguments. But the decline of history has certainly attracted attention in high places. When Bob Carr became Premier in New South Wales, Carr, as we know, is something of a history buff with his special interest in the career of Abraham Lincoln and others, he was disturbed at the lack of history teaching in schools, and we're led to believe that his concern was instrumental in the introduction of much more history into New South Wales schools. I think we're becoming familiar now with other shades of this present concern. Who was the first Prime Minister of Australia? This was the question being aired the other day to test our knowledge of Australian history. Now, in the general debate about the Republic, the Australian Federation, its constitution, how to celebrate the new millennium, the role of history is being examined more closely. Perhaps for the first time for quite a while, we're hearing statements that it should be compulsory for students to be exposed at some point in their education to studies in Australian history. In the United States, this kind of debate is actually quite muted. The reason is that the state simply requires most of its students, in most of the states, perhaps in all of them, it's a requirement that you study 2 years of history before graduation. And it's American history pretty largely. Even the history of the individual state is required in some places. History there is recognised as a significant carrier of essential public knowledge, inculcating not only respect for the past, but pride in the nation, patriotism and so on. Many American teachers are amazed to hear of our system and the lowly place often accorded to teaching the nation's history. Well, where does this leave our society? Its role now seems to be more important, in the light of what I've said, than it did in 1974. Against a background in which fewer future citizens may know much of their past, having been nurtured by an education system that seems to want to deny them that heritage, these same students are going to enter a society which nevertheless expects them to be aware of that heritage. This society obviously will have to help make up some of that lost ground in this endeavour. The second point I want to mention is something about publishing and history books. When the Society was formed in 1974, South Australia was home to a major Australian publishing firm, Rigby Limited. The firm had a strong focus on publishing books with history content. Think of Rigby's sketchbook series, which in 1974 was at its height. The handsome Mitcham Village sketchbook in the larger format was published in that year. It was about the 66th title in that series, and there were quite a number more still to come. The scope of the series was broad, even stretching to Auckland and Fiji, but there were many South Australian titles, often of quite small communities such as Yankalilla. Well, Rigby's, with its roots reaching well back into South Australia's history, has now gone, victim at least in part of those who coveted business assets and some of the newfangled ways of commerce that came into fashion in the 1970s and 1980s. It was a recipe, of course, that brought down many of the old names in South Australian business life, and a situation from which we're still trying to recover. I was reminded this evening in something that John TREGENZA had said about this, and we have lost not only, of course, some of those companies, but we've lost the invaluable records which have gone with them. The ANZ Bank, Bill Gamage and I fronted here in South Australia just after the merger of the ANZ Bank and the Bank of Adelaide, and it promised us that they would not dispose of the records of the bank, priceless historical records, nor would they move them. Well, they certainly haven't disposed of them, but they did move them. They went off to Melbourne in a truck one night. So if you want to study the history of the Bank of Adelaide, go to Melbourne and do it. Going back to Rigby's for a minute, when it didn't initiate a historical work, the firm could bring out a new edition and make it much more widely known. If I could just illustrate the rather sober cover of Donald Meinig's On the Margins of the Good Earth. And it was a book that, I remind you, this landmark in South Australian and Australian historiography. It was originally published in 1962 as the second in their monograph series by the Association of American Geographers. Hardly a series that South Australians then would know existed or would even have the chance to buy. Well, Rigby's brought out that book some years later in this form, and I suppose it's the form that many of you will have yourselves. In that form it became widely known to the general public and to generations of students. Rigby's also invigorated other titles originally published interstate. Geoffrey Dutton's Founder of a City, The Life of Colonel William Light, was first published by Cheshire in Melbourne in 1960. Rigby's took it over for their Seal series in 1971. Both Meinig's and Dutton's books in this form cost the princely sum of $1.50 new. I think Oswald Pryor's Australia's Little Cornwall was the same. We then had 2 or 3 small publishers as well, which, when they weren't publishing new titles on South Australian history, were publishing important older titles in facsimile form. Thus came the 2-volume editions of Rodney Coburn's Pastoral Pioneers of South Australia and Burgess's Cyclopedia of South Australia. Such activity, of course, was an invaluable service. I think if my house was burning down tonight and the EFS officers said you've got just half a minute to go inside and get something that you think will be of much use to you in your appreciation of South Australian history, I'd make a beeline for Burgess's Cyclopedia and I could get it out in less than half a minute, heavy as it is. Well, we had an outpouring of books on South Australian history when this society was being formed in that year 1974. Dr. Michael Williams' book, The Making of the South Australian Landscape, was published in that year. Marjorie Scales' History of Walkerville, and Robert Noy, we've mentioned him a moment ago, Robert Noy's History of Clare, were among several other titles appearing in the year. Bob Noy was a foundation member of this society, as was Michael Williams. Michael Williams, as has been mentioned, led the society's field trip, its first field trip, on the 5th of April 1975 to Gawler, Wasleys and Kapunda. Can any of you remember it? Several can, that's great. We filled 2 buses, if you remember, 2 bus loads. We had 70 people. We left from our old meeting spot outside the War Memorial and headed off first of all to the tip of the range east of Salisbury, where Dr. Williams explained how early settlers denuded Peachy Belt from the plain below, a task once thought impossible. The excursion proceeded to Smithfield, where we looked at the old Augusta Square. I looked at my Burgess tonight before I came, thinking, now what was the square, and particularly what was the church, which Dr. Williams had reminded us had just been lost from that square. Well, sure enough, Burgess says, look, there are 2 churches in Smithfield. One is Methodist and one is Presbyterian. I don't know which one was lost in 1973, if it was then, but I guess it might have been the Methodist. Then we went on to Gawler. We looked at its town plan, its industrial history, then went to the Gilbert Valley and Kapunda. I also recall some trouble with one of the buses. To return for a moment to publishing books, it's fortunate that locally the Wakefield Press has played a prominent role in recent years, especially for the 1986 sesquicentenary program, and that some other publishers and local bodies have also published historical works. But some of the edge seems to have gone out of the enterprise. The 25 years of the Society's existence have not seen the publishing of many of those broader studies that were a feature of the 1960s and much of the 1970s. Can we take an example? I've long admired Hans Mincham's book, The Story of the Flinders Ranges, a book which first appeared in 1965. Hans is a foundation member of this society, but he can't be with us tonight. Sadly, that book has been out of print for a number of years. I think that's a regrettable commentary on what's happened to the publishing industry in this state and nationally. It's well researched, carefully written, and that such a book should languish without a publisher to keep it available, I think is a crime. It can't be because of lack of interest in the subject itself, since I think the Flinders Ranges bulk as large in the public mind, perhaps as they do in the landscape itself. Mincham's book, for anyone with even a cursory interest in such an important region, provides a framework to enable the casual visitor to appreciate the region more, a framework to enable the more persevering inquirer to understand the forces that have shaped the region as we now know it, and a framework to allow the historian exploring a particular theme to be better prepared for the task. The book also has the great value, the virtue of modesty. Note its title. It's not a history of the Flinders Ranges, but a story of the Flinders Ranges. And Mincham concludes the 3rd edition by saying, thus we end the story of these highlands that direct the wobbly figure of somewhat higher rainfall deep into the arid interior of the continent. Well, would that we had more stories like his of other regions of South Australia. Brian has referred, I think, in passing to that as well. For example, we've no history of no story, I should say, of the evolution of the Riverland district of the state, and none of the southeast. How much we need something about those 2 regions alone. There's a model for the southeast, of course, in the work of Margaret Kiddle. Peter has mentioned her this evening, in her book Men of Yesterday, that superb social history of the Western District of Victoria in the period 1834 to 1890, the book first published in 1961. Then there's South Australia's Mallee country, a huge area with its distinctive patterns of Aboriginal and European occupation, tough country, exacting to live in, requiring special techniques to manage it and make a living from it. And it burns too, as we've seen in the last week. The 19th century settler found it a formidable barrier even to get into it. The compiler of Baillieu's Gazetteer said of it, or at least a part of it, in 1866, he was talking about the Murray-Mallee, occasionally an adventurous settler has taken a few days' supply of water and provisions and has gone 50 or 60 miles beyond the nearest settlement, but such journeys have only confirmed the idea that the scrub is totally unfit for any purpose. There are only a few places, however, where it can even be explored. The trees grow close together like reeds, and certainly not thicker, without a branch until about 14 feet from the ground. And so dense are they that 10 and 12 stems may be counted springing from one root, and occupy little more than a square foot of ground. Where a road has been cut through it, it appears as though there were a high wall on each side. Indeed, the effect is not unlike that produced by a road through a trench. Yet we know the Mallee was explored, settled, and Murray Mallee and huge areas of it elsewhere. And apart from Meinig and one or two others who've probed certain parts and periods of that area and of that history, and I'm not forgetting the local historians who've looked at certain communities of it over a longer period, we have a curiously shallow literature about human history in the Mallee. How much do we need to have a full-scale history of such an interesting area, or, Hans Mitchum's term, story of it? It could be presented perhaps as a kind of war history. Perhaps, to borrow the gazetteer's phrase, it could have an appropriate war title, Roads Through Trenches. To complete this topic, what we've missed in the last 25 years, and what then I'm really arguing for, are the South Australian companions to a range of books about regional Australia, which take broad themes over a few and even many decades. Stories like Gordon Buxton's The Riverina, Duncan Waterson's Squatter, Selector and Storekeeper, History of the Darling Downs, and two books of Geoffrey Bolton's, 1,000 Miles Away, his History of the North Queensland to 1920, and his other book, A Fine Country to Starve In, the latter giving a study of the impact of the Great Depression on Perth and its hinterland. By the way, the latter book has one of the most delightful quotations one could ever set opposite the first page of the text, especially a book entitled A Fine Country to Starve In. It's also a quotation fit for our dream book, Roads Through Trenches. It's in Latin, from Virgil's Georgics. O fortunatus nimulum suasi bona norent agricolas, which Bolton impishly translates to help us in case we've forgotten our Latin. The cocky farmers never had it so good if only they knew which side their bread was buttered. One last word about this. Such studies need not necessarily be solely the province of university lecturers or PhD students. Hans Mitchum's wasn't, nor that fine study of the lands west of the Darling, Bobby Hardy's west of the Darling, and one could go on. Well, that's a regret. It's a bit of a moan, if you like, about things that have happened during the history of this society, and I'm not saying that the society by any means should be blamed for it.
Those of you who are visitors, don't worry, we don't usually run this late, but I don't think anybody's complaining. I can't, even in this seat, I can't hear anybody complaining. But I would like to finish, as we usually do, by asking another enthusiast for South Australia, our Vice President Morris, if he'd just say a few words of thanks. I did promise you we could have a couple of questions. I think we'll share the good stories and the reminiscences over supper, if everybody's happy with that.
Tonight, Rob has had a great privilege and honour in introducing some very, very distinguished people who have had made a great contribution to the society. It's my great privilege on behalf of all of you to extend our sincere thanks for their valuable contributions tonight, and I share with Ron that Rob Nichol also deserves to be honoured tonight, and I think that the gesture Ron made was very, very appropriate. But we have in front of us here four very, very distinguished people of the society. Three of them took on the difficult task of being president at some stage or other. The other one was invited to on several occasions, but his modesty and his desire to sort of keep a little bit more in the background meant that Brian Samuels never has so far, and there's still hope. But Brian has not taken on the honour of being a president of the society, but his contribution has been very, very outstanding, and I think that the talk that he gave us tonight and sharing some of his dreams and so on indicated the valuable service that he has given. But all of these people, you've heard them tonight. I'm not going to say any more. It's a great honour.